If a system were truly built on truth, it would never fear being questioned. But religion is not just a belief system. It's a structure of power. And power, no matter how sacred it claims to be, always trembles before doubt. A single question, seemingly harmless, is like a crack in the wall of dogma, a sign that obedience is no longer absolute. When someone asks why, they aren't just seeking an answer. They're challenging the authority of those who claim to speak for truth itself. Religion survives by enforcing certainty, yet every question is the enemy of certainty. Each one opens the possibility that maybe they're wrong, and that possibility alone is enough to shake the entire foundation. That's why, across cultures and centuries, the questioner is rarely seen as a seeker of truth, but as a traitor. Religion does not fear losing God. It fears losing power in God's name. Because once people learn to question, they learn to think for themselves. And when minds begin to think freely, no one can control them with faith anymore. Religions claim to hold absolute truth, answers to the biggest questions no human can verify. What happens after death? Who created the universe? Why do we suffer? These claims sound powerful until someone dares to ask for proof. That's where everything starts to tremble. Because a question doesn't destroy truth, it only reveals what isn't true. And when sacred claims can't stand up to the simplest question, their weakness becomes impossible to hide. Doubt is dangerous not because it's evil, but because it's honest. It forces the believer to face uncertainty, the one thing faith depends on avoiding. A child asking, "If God made everything, who made God?" isn't being rebellious. They're doing what the human mind was built to do: seek coherence. The tragedy is that religions often mistake that search for sin. They brand curiosity as rebellion and uncertainty as weakness. But doubt isn't the enemy of truth, it's the path to it. And the moment we realize that, the illusion of sacred certainty begins to crack.
Throughout history, religion has survived not through open dialogue, but through control of the narrative. The easiest way to protect fragile ideas is to punish those who question them. In medieval Europe, asking the wrong question could get you branded a heretic, tortured, exiled, or burned alive. In parts of the Islamic world, scholars who challenged orthodox interpretations were silenced or erased. Even today, in some communities, simply doubting a sacred text can mean losing your family, your friends, or your safety. This pattern isn't random cruelty, it's strategy. When power is built on unquestioned authority, curiosity becomes a threat. A single question, why, can spread faster than any sermon. It forces people to think, compare, and see inconsistencies that institutions depend on hiding. That's why religions have always feared philosophers, reformers, and skeptics. Not because they were wrong, but because they made others start to wonder. And once people begin to wonder, control starts to slip away. The suppression of questions isn't about protecting faith. It's about protecting hierarchy, because a truly divine truth wouldn't need guards at the door. Religions don't just claim to reveal truth. They claim to own it. For centuries, they've positioned themselves as the only reliable source of meaning, morality, and purpose. But the moment someone starts asking questions, that monopoly begins to crack. A question is a comparison. It asks, what if there's another explanation? Or, what if goodness doesn't require belief? And that's dangerous because comparison exposes alternatives, and alternatives threaten control. If someone says morality only comes from Scripture, a single question: why do good people exist outside this faith? Dismantles that claim. If someone says divine law governs all ethics, history shows countless societies that built justice without gods. Each question opens a door, and once open, people start walking through. That's why religions try to silence doubt before it spreads. It's not truth they fear losing. It's exclusivity. Questions invite people to discover that meaning and morality can come from empathy, reason, and shared humanity, not from obedience to authority. In the end, the danger of questions isn't that they destroy faith. It's that they remind us we never needed a gatekeeper to live ethically in the first place. In most religions, doubt isn't treated as curiosity. It's treated as betrayal. From the moment you start asking, "What if?" you've already stepped 1 foot outside the circle. That's why institutions fear doubt so deeply. It's not rebellion yet, but it's the seed of freedom. Faith systems are built to be closed loops. Every answer points back to the same authority. But doubt breaks that loop. It introduces friction where there used to be obedience. It turns passive belief into active reflection. Leaders sense this immediately, which is why doubt is often labeled as sin, pride, or even a form of spiritual sickness. Once someone starts doubting, the control begins to fade. The fear-based obedience weakens. They start realizing that questioning doesn't destroy truth. It only destroys illusions. That's why religions must demonize doubt. Because once people understand that doubt is not the enemy of faith, but the beginning of awareness, the walls of unquestioned authority start to crumble. Doubt doesn't make you lost. It means you've started thinking for yourself. Every question is a small act of rebellion. It introduces uncertainty into systems that depend on absolute certainty to survive. Religion, like any power structure, thrives on stability, on people accepting answers instead of seeking them. A single question can begin to unravel centuries of tradition, authority, and fear. When someone asks, "Why?" instead of, "How high should I jump?" control starts to weaken. Questions shift focus from obedience to understanding, from "What should I believe?" to "What makes sense?" That shift is dangerous to any institution built on hierarchy. Power doesn't fear violence as much as it fears doubt. Violence can be suppressed, but questions spread quietly, infecting minds one conversation at a time. Once people begin to think, the old order can no longer maintain its sacred aura. That's why religious authorities often frame curiosity as arrogance or sin. Not because questions are evil, but because they're contagious. Asking a question doesn't destroy faith immediately, but it plants the first crack in blind devotion. And once that crack appears, truth eventually seeps in. Religion isn't just a belief system. It's an economy of faith, guilt, and hope. Behind the sacred symbols often lies a network of financial, social, and psychological interests. When people begin to question, they don't just challenge theology. They disrupt a business model. Doubt threatens the flow of donations, the authority of preachers, and the emotional dependence that keeps followers loyal. A believer who starts thinking critically is a customer who stops buying spiritual reassurance. That's why institutions often equate faith with virtue and skepticism with betrayal. It protects their economy. But the threat isn't only financial. On a psychological level, religion offers comfort and identity. Questioning those foundations can feel like self-destruction. Many would rather cling to illusion than face the terror of not knowing.
In this way, religion defends itself not just through dogma, but through emotion. Fear, guilt, and belonging. Questions break that emotional contract, forcing people to confront uncomfortable truths about power, profit, and manipulation. To ask who benefits from my belief is not heresy. It's liberation. Because once you see the machinery behind the miracle, faith loses its magic, and freedom begins. A truth that cannot endure questioning was never truth to begin with. The moment a belief demands silence instead of dialogue, obedience instead of curiosity, it reveals its fragility. Strong ideas welcome scrutiny. Weak ones hide behind authority. Religious institutions often claim that doubt is dangerous, that asking questions offends the divine. But if God is real, why would he fear a question? If a belief is truly solid, why must it be protected from examination? The fear of inquiry exposes that what's being defended is not truth. It's control. Throughout history, every movement that forbade questioning eventually collapsed under the weight of its own insecurity. The same pattern repeats. Suppression replaces confidence, and the result is decay, not devotion. To fear questions is to confess weakness, to admit that faith cannot stand on its own without censorship, guilt, or blind loyalty. The search for truth doesn't destroy meaning, it deepens it. A belief that survives honest questioning becomes stronger. A belief that forbids it was never alive. For many believers, religion is more than a system of ideas. It's who they are. Their faith is intertwined with family, community, and cultural pride. So when someone asks hard questions about doctrine or morality, it doesn't just feel like an intellectual challenge. It feels personal, like an attack on identity itself. That's why questioning belief often provokes defensiveness or anger. The question is not heard as, "Is this idea true?" but as, "Are you wrong?" Religious institutions understand this dynamic well. They fuse faith with belonging so tightly that to doubt one is to risk losing the other. The result is emotional blackmail disguised as loyalty. Tradition, too, becomes a shield against inquiry. People inherit beliefs from ancestors and call them sacred, not because they are true, but because they are old. To question them feels like betrayal, a rejection of history, heritage, and family. Yet, every tradition that refuses to evolve eventually fossilizes into dogma. When questions are treated as threats rather than opportunities, identity becomes a cage. True strength is not found in defending the past at all costs, but in allowing truth, even uncomfortable truth, to reshape who we are. Every great awakening in human history began with a question. What if they're wrong? What if there's another way? What if truth doesn't need permission? These simple doubts have done more to free the human mind than any sermon or scripture ever could. Religion teaches that faith is strength and doubt is weakness. But in reality, unquestioned belief is submission, and questioning is the birth of awareness. When we dare to ask, we reclaim ownership of our thoughts. We move from obedience to understanding, from fear to curiosity. Powerful institutions, religious or otherwise, survive by discouraging questions. Because a mind that questions cannot be ruled for long. It sees through manipulation, challenges authority, and seeks truth beyond tradition. That is why every prophet, philosopher, and scientist who changed the world began not with certainty, but with wonder. Freedom doesn't come from believing the right thing. It comes from having the courage to ask why you believe anything at all.
To question is not to destroy faith, it's to refine it, to strip away illusion until only truth remains. The moment you stop fearing questions is the moment you begin to think freely. And that, perhaps, is the most sacred act of all.